Another way that the Federal Reserve can influence how much money is in the economy, which then would influence like if the economy is running really fast or if it's kind of going slow, is by changing this thing we call the discount rate. Now here's the thing. When we think about borrowing money, we often just think about like when I go to a bank and borrow money from the bank, right? I might borrow money to go buy a car, and then the rule is that I have to pay that money back to the bank, but I have to pay it back with interest. And so if I borrowed $100, I might actually have to pay back $101. So I have to pay this money back to the bank. So I actually have to pay back more than I originally borrowed. The amount that I borrow, I'm sorry, the amount that I pay, the amount of interest I pay is based off of an interest rate. Okay? The higher the interest rate, the more I have to pay back, the more the interest is. All right? The lower the interest rate, the less I have to pay back. So, as you can imagine, high interest rates discourage people from borrowing very much, and low interest rates, encourage that. They makes them want to go borrow more and more because you can get a lot of money and not have to pay that much for it. Well, the Federal Reserve, believe it or not, also lends money, just like banks will lend money to us. The Fed lends money to banks. And the interest rate that banks have to pay when they borrow from the Fed, because they have to pay interest rates just like we pay to them, the interest rate that the Fed charges them is known as the discount rate. And so what that means is like this. If the Fed wants to encourage a lot of money to get pushed down into banks, and then, by default, then the next logical step would be that then this money would then go into the economy. What they need to do is they need to keep the interest rates low. So they will set their own interest rate, their discount rate, at a low number. Let's say it's 3%, okay? Very low interest rate. Banks are going to be like, ooh, I want some of that. And so banks are going to go to the Fed and they're going to borrow a lot of money. Let me see if I can get this organized here. They're going to say, oh, Fed, you've got all this cash from the government. Give it to me for 3%. So this bank's going to borrow some, this bank's going to borrow some, and this bank's going to borrow some, right? Then, when people go to the banks will have money to lend to them. So this bank will lend money to me, and this bank will lend money, to you, and whatever. There's now going to be a lot of money in the economy. Well, what if the Federal Reserve wants to prevent that from happening? Like, what if they want to essentially like shut off the flow of money from it down to us, right? Maybe there's too much money in the economy. Maybe we have inflation right now, and they know that if we keep adding money, it's going to make inflation worse. They might want to kind of cut that off. All they have to do is raise the discount rate. So if we raise this discount rate from 3% up to 13%, now all of a sudden, whomp, 13%, that's a pretty high interest rate. Now what we'll find is that these banks, get these out of the way, these banks are going to look at that high interest rate and they're going to be like, I'm not so sure. And we might not have as many banks borrowing from the Fed, right? Maybe only one bank will be willing to pay that high interest rate. And these other two banks are going to be like, no thanks, I'm not going to pay 13%. Well, now when someone goes to a bank and asks for a loan, there's not as much money in the banking industry to give to the economy, right? Even if this loan is made, that's not that much money now in the economy. It's not as much as there was before that interest rate went up. So this increasing of the discount rate, it never completely stops lending, but it is a way to sort of turn it down. And again, the Fed would do this if they feel like the economy should not have as much money pouring into it. There you go. That's the discount rate.